Hello, Rob Bertholf here. I'm excited to do an interesting presentation today on this idea of pattern matching existence. And well, if you're familiar with my content, you've probably seen how I have a very firm stand on a monotheistic perspective, but it wasn't always the case. And this is kind of a journey of how I got to where I am today. And so this is almost a palate cleanser, if you will. This idea of kind of going back to awakening more of this idea of an objective reality, re-looking at things that maybe we took for granted. And so this is a bit of a journey that I went on, and I'm excited to take you on the same journey. I think the first place is so many of us have essentially become complacent of what we identify knowledge as, right? We walk around essentially in darkness, distracted by the cares and the worries of the world. And we don't think about maybe the most important thing, which is our existence. Now, I cover this a lot more in a course on rethinking thinking. Take a look at that there. That kind of dives into all the different cognitive biases that, ultimately that we carry with us. But I think a piece of that we'll piggyback on is this idea of the importance of early education and how that programming period happens, right? So the question is this: what if, rather than growing up, and kind of progressively learning, with that first 6 to 8 years, observing as a child, being taught things by your parents, by teachers, by the media, by peers, whatever it is. What if we were to come into existence today, right? What if all of a sudden we just appeared without any explanation? No memories, no bias, no preconceptions, no historical reference, no philosophical context. What if we just appeared? Now, you're always aware that you exist, but what if you didn't know anything more than that? How would you explain your existence? How would you approach learning, and what could you even trust as truth? Right? Where would you start to kind of piece everything together? What would that process be like if you just appeared? Would you feel crazy, or would you feel liberated from the previous, the idea of the programming that we understand, right? And would you be excited to learn about why and how you exist? Now, this is a story about how we'd approach reconciling consciousness. And I'll spare some of the details, but when I had reached my most dismantled state, I started to question existence itself. Now, what was that, seemingly true, okay? What was I thinking or seemed to be thinking? That's all that I could count on. That's what seemed to be true. So this made me believe in my consciousness. And I was not sure exactly what it meant. I just knew that in some form or another, I was conscious. And this became my truth. Then I needed to understand its implications and what potential realities could exist from this state. Instinctively understood that if I could identify narratives that supported this state, that I could kind of try on, so to speak, the lens of each of these theories for myself and see what else was demonstrably evident or logical or at least probable. Next, the question was, what's the relationship between my mind and the physical world? I process my awareness of stimulus and the ability to receive stimulus and somehow use this information in order to respond. This is this idea of functional consciousness. Researching into various publications, including the attention schema theory, which suggests that consciousness evolved as a response to too much information in the nervous system, and that all vertebrates have consciousness to some degree. The concept of the brain constructing subjective awareness makes sense to me. However, the theory slips into materialism and has similarities with illusionist theories. Right? Ultimately, while it could explain functional consciousness, I found, ultimately in researching this, that it didn't explain phenomenal consciousness. And that's where I was very puzzled again. Right? This is a way to ultimately rationalize away, when we understand this idea of consciousness, right? It kind of gets rationalized away with this idea of quantum phenomenon, and it seems quantum becomes the go-to when trying to rationalize the irrational. But some scientists and philosophers consider it to be unconvincing, leaving no reputable scientific theory to explain this. The problem of consciousness goes on. Look, like, big terms aside, I needed to understand how sensations acquire characteristics such as color, taste, smell, and how these would be universally similar. More interestingly, how some people would like a particular smell and others would not like how something tastes or smells. Right? This idea of this idea of preference. What's the evolutionary rationale for individuality? What's the evolutionary rationale for preference? And this brings us to the hard problem of consciousness, which is left, unanswered. Several pieces: the non-algorithmic processing theory, nonlinear and chaotic dynamics, quantum mechanics. All of this still doesn't explain the hard problem of consciousness. And this problem is explaining why and how we have qualia, or phenomenal experiences. That is to say, it's the problem of why we have personal first-person experiences, often described as experiences that feel like something. In comparison, we assume that there's no such experiences for inanimate things, like, for instance, a thermostat, a toaster, a computer, right? Even any, sophisticated artificial intelligence. So where do we go from here? And in reading other works of cognitive sciences, such as David Chalmers, right, the hard problem of consciousness is at a hard stop for the theory of evolutionary materialism. Although he did not necessarily rule it out as a problem for Darwinism, Chalmers later, continues that just because traditional theism requires evolution to be false, the falsity, all right, of materialism does not positively suggest that theism is true. Is to say that just because consciousness cannot be rationally explained through evolutionary theory does not prove God exists. But it does lend to a viewpoint of some form of intelligent design, such as, I don't know, a computer simulation or a designer, right? A creator God. Evolution ultimately, on its own, is a hard stop, right? There must be an additional layer to explain consciousness. On its own, the Big Bang, none of that makes any sense without some sort of layer on top of it. And so how do we define this layer? And Chalmers went on to try and develop a theory to explain why he called the fatal problem for materialism, and invented this term called non-reductive physicalism, right? So where the theory was, it was unexplainable but somehow integrated into science. Look, he makes it far more complicated, but in summary, what was clear is that physical science cannot explain consciousness. So answers start to come from the metaphysical. And metaphysics is the branch of philosophy, right? The word, metaphysics comes from two Greek words that essentially means, after the natural, right? So many scientists, though, have suggested that this is much or all, of metaphysics should be rejected. And so again, we go back to this idea of what is this layer, right? And we're looking into this idea of this. Dr. A. Egnor, right, he writes, an adequate explanation of existence seems to require causation at some level by immaterial agency. Intelligent design theorists would agree. Here we go. Agency is real and leaves its fingerprints, immaterial fingerprints. So I agree fully with that there has to be some sort of immaterial agency. There has to be this idea that there has to be an agency, right? And it has to have, and it's put its fingerprints. And so ultimately at this point, without even analyzing anything yet, right, there's only three logical assumptions that I can, logically deduce, right? So one, there's a higher power, right? Some sort of God, right, that created us to have consciousness. Scenario B is that we're actually just in a machine, right? We are AI, and that some programmer developed us, right? Both of these are intelligent design. And now there's a third, which is like something else supernatural is going on, and we can explain that. We have to look to explain that. But two of the three immediately are explained by some form of intelligent design, whether it's a programmer or whether it's a God, right? And so, I kind of, we're able to kind of put these into some boxes, and then I started thinking more, and I got into this another problem, right? There was still free will to factor in, or essentially a more specialized question is how to rationalize the subjective notion that we are in control of our decisions, or at least in some measure, with the customary view, causality that subsequent events are caused by prior events. And at this point, ultimately, like, I'm going to be honest, I just started to spiral, right? Literally, it felt like my brain was going to short circuit. And It was just too much for me to get my brain around. And then, as I tried to reacclimate, I began to notice my chest expand and collapse. And it kind of dawned on me, right? And so I started to focus on my breath. And I started to think about the concept that I'm inhaling and exhaling, something that I cannot see, but I can still feel, right? It's going through my nostrils, right? It repeats. The more I focus on it, the more fascinated at how it happens on its own, effortlessly, like behind the scenes. I realized that I can control it, but not for very long. And that's so fascinating to me, was this idea that I tried to stop the process. I tried to literally to stop myself from breathing, but I wasn't able. Even covering my face, I'm unable to stop myself from breathing. Self-preservation is hardwired into us as some defense mechanism. So what am I supposed to do with that data? What's the implication of my inability to stop breathing? What's being protected? And this leads me to this idea that my significant, that my existence must be significant. And if we don't believe that existence is significant, why wouldn't we have already stopped breathing, stopped feeding ourselves, or even taken action to terminate our existence? As we cannot value something that has no significance, and the novelty for many in life is already worn off. So why can't it be disregarded like a thought? What stops us from harming ourselves? What keeps us breathing? It's built into our instincts for self-preservation. And why would we have hardwired self-preservation if it was not to protect something significant? Right? If our existence is worth protecting, what is the purpose of this? What is being protected? And by whom? If evolution, why build in a self-preservation mechanism? Right? How could that even evolve? How can I rationalize survival of the fittest and also self-preservation? And then it goes down to, ultimately, why do we exist? What's our directive? If a higher purpose was only self-gratification, or do we have a real higher purpose? Science does not have an answer to this. In fact, most things require belief. Now, there's different levels of science, right? There's the observable, this is the laws and the facts. There's an extrapolation of this laws and facts, which we put into theories. But ultimately, most of these theories move into, you just kind of have to believe, because it may be an extrapolation of the observable, but most theories require belief. And so wouldn't that then put it kind of like a religion? Rather than giving up grounds towards the creator God, Hamilton theorized in this scenario that there were alien life that triggered evolution, somehow setting up in a way of natural selection. Given time, the world would produce a superior form of intelligent design. So, this renowned evolutionary biologist, he says that, well, it's likely aliens. And so now we have all three of these are focused on intelligent design, right? If the logical assumption C, this idea of something supernatural, is that if they're responsible for putting human life in motion, then all three are intelligent design. And, so this is where ultimately I kind of start reaching a level of comfort, because, I've been a developer. In fact, it's bizarre. I had to do the math. I've been a developer for almost 30 or over 30 years. And for the last 30 years, I've built a lot of projects. And every time I build a project, I put some sort of feature, right, that has my signature on it, right? Most developers do. These are called Easter eggs, something you hide. So essentially, I add, my fun little fingerprints to my code. Nobody usually sees it. But, if I'm building a game, right, where would I make that it could be seen? So if I was going to program existence, assuming that, there isn't, from this, the only logical conclusion for me is that there's intelligent design, aliens, AI programmers, and a creator God. All three of those would say that there's intelligent design. And so the question is, where would I put this little Easter egg in? Like how would I let my creation know that I exist? What would I build in? What clues would I hard code into existence? And this is when I look down at my hand, and the first thing I see is that I'm demonstrably unique. I have a fingerprint that is my unique identifier. So I go outside and I start exploring the surroundings, and The more I pay attention, I start seeing the same patterns over and over. There's a fingerprint in nature. And it's just interesting that it just continues all throughout. You can't stop seeing it. It's everywhere. If you have your eyes open, the Easter egg is easy to be found. Over and over in plants and animals and fish, in the water itself, in the air, in space, at all levels, micro and macro, it exists. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's now everywhere, and it's the same organic yet geometric pattern. And that's what's so beautiful, is that it's geometric, but it's unique in its geometry. It follows the rules of geometry, and yet is organic in its fingerprint of geometry. It's been documented, that symmetry is associated with beauty. And it's so interesting how, our facial features and every aspect of us is, following these patterns. The same ratio is in the hand, and when it's clutched, right, it's because, the bones in the hand actually perfectly align in a golden ratio. The same ratio in the hand, is ultimately found all throughout. It's this idea of this special ratio. It's math. And so that started me thinking, okay, well, what about math? If we start thinking about mathematics, we have to acknowledge that mathematics was discovered and not invented. So how does something so complex even exist, right? It would require an intelligent designer. The same spiral exists everywhere. And it's so interesting, right, the layout to it. As you kind of see it, it just kind of builds on itself, right? Something really interesting is if you zoom in and try and recreate it, we can actually see that it has a very structured pattern. So we have a box, then we have another box, and then we have another box, right, bigger than that, and then we have a box just bigger than that, and then we have a box just bigger than that, and so on. And so what does nature teach us, right? So no box plus a box equals a box. So we add that box into the graph, right? Hang in there, it's going to make sense, right? Now we have the first red box plus this second orange box, and it's the same to create a yellow box. So we can, now let's ignore the red and let's just work the last two boxes. So orange plus yellow equals green. Now we count off 3 and expand out a box from there, right? And you can keep going out with this and graph this out. And so what we see is this box pattern forms what we ultimately call the golden spiral or the Fibonacci spiral. And this is just so interesting to me how nature actually teaches us how to count, right? It just keeps going. So we learn, again, this idea of, no box plus one box, right? This is us learning mathematics from nature. It's inherent in, it's like, it's built in. It's just so bizarre to me, right? This idea that we have these kind of integers that are formed. And now we've given, right, the names of these integers. We've given them names, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. But ultimately, we can see that they break down to essentially a value. And so by giving these boxes a numerical value, we represent this, logical pattern. And this is how we get the sequence, 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 12, 21, 34, etc., right? Nature teaches us the Fibonacci sequence. It teaches us mathematics, and as it expands. And so I highly recommend, if you want to geek out, go to Numberphile on YouTube. They got great stuff, and they explain even more on this idea of the Fibonacci mystery. But what I want to get into is that it's deeper than just, something simple, right? We actually go into if you've ever looked in the Mandelbrot set. So Mandelbrot is this idea of, these little shapes that kind of form subshapes and subshapes and subshapes, and each of these have a numerical counting system on it. And so you can literally count. You can learn to count just based on the nodes of a Mandelbrot. And again, recommend going deeper into that. But what we start to see is that geometry and these patterns go so much more complex. It's, the fractals that exist in mathematics, right, which is conceptual, but also in the real world, right? This is the broccoli, the fractal of the broccoli. It's so bizarre how the mathematical, right, the theoretical world essentially, is so ingrained in the physical world. And we can look throughout and see that the same sequence is, obeyed, organically obeyed throughout nature. We can look at here in the fern, and interesting just the way everything is built, right? The Barnsley fern is like this idea that each leaflet is the entire shape, and so it's replicated. Now, if you want to tell me this is a big computer simulation, okay, that makes sense to me, right? Like this literally would make sense. But if you want to tell me that I've evolved from nothing and this detail is just somehow created randomly, I mean, I can't fathom that. That's just idiocy. And so I can get behind a lot of existence scenarios, but not one without an intelligent designer. From a secular perspective, we read that ultimately it's it's difficult to avoid the impression that a miracle confronts us here, or two miracles, right? The existence of laws of nature and the human mind's capacity to divine them. And as we start getting into numbers, it just gets so obvious that there's something exterior that's holding this together. It's just bizarre, right? The symmetry, the beauty, the expansion, and that's when we got into this idea of the Sabbath ratio, where if you take essentially 1 divided by 7, you get, which is, by the way, the Sabbath rest divided by the days of the week, you get this insane, beautifully insane number, and it repeats 142,857, or 856 actually, if you were to get into it. But it's just so interesting how it forms. It's replicable, and when you start to times it by itself, like again, it's just like it blows my mind, the depth of the patterns, the symmetry, and just everything screams there's something more going on. And again, we analyze the same pattern listed now is found in a pine cone or in a sunflower, right? And we start seeing that they follow a very specific pattern. And this one here is called, again, the golden ratio, right? So it's all played out, right? The golden ratio can be defined in terms of itself. You can use a formula to try and calculate it for yourself, and first gets its value, and then runs calculation again and again, divide 1 by your value, and then add 1, and kind of going through that. But ultimately what we find is that a flower could not exist without this rational number, right? It's so bizarre, because number file again goes into explaining this, how if it wasn't this very specific number, the way that a leaf would be developed would actually overlap over itself. Essentially, it wouldn't work, right? So as we start looking into this idea that the golden ratio is, it's really at the core of making making organic symmetry, right? So it's this idea: we place the next petal, right, 137.5 degrees rotation, and we place the next, and we repeat. We get this very natural placement of things. And if we repeat and repeat again, we start to see this pattern. And again, it just goes so deep. The point is, I can't reconcile anything other than intelligent design when I see mathematics. We read here from Einstein, it says, "How can it be that mathematics, being after all product of human thought, which is independent of experience, is so admirably appropriate to the object of reality?" It's something that even Einstein couldn't wrap his mind around. So there's a connection between the physical world, which obeyed mathematics, right? Something was discovered, not invented, with the subjective world. And there's an interesting relationship between the subjective world and the physical world. But there again, there's that mind-body problem that cannot be explained without understanding consciousness. We can keep going and looking at other things. Right? We did mathematics. What about sound? Right? Nikola Tesla said, if you want to find the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, vibration. Right? And if we get into it, we can look into string theory. And string theory is this idea, right? As you probably already know, it arose in the 1960s, a way to correct holes in the earlier work of Einstein, right? And reads here that the theoretical framework that attempts to address that can vibrate different ways, etc. So This kind of inspiration for theme or for string theory came about when it was noticed in the late 60s that the phenomena associated with the strong nuclear force seemed to follow the mathematics of Euler's beta function, though at the time no one really knew why that should be. Right? They had a formula for, in search of a theory of why it should work, and then in 1970 some physicists realized that, like, hey, like, the vibration strings can also be described by this beta function. So, voila, here we are. Maybe strong nuclear force and, actually incredibly, strong vibrational strings and fundamental characteristics of this particle, such as mass, charge, spin, yada, yada, yada. So what ends up coming out of this, and by the way, there's an interesting book that goes, incredibly complex that you can get into this. But where it comes down to is this idea, and they're using this to kind of explain, the Big Bang. Okay, but let's just make a gross oversimplification because it's too complex for me anyways, right? So let's just look at it simpler. The question is, if vibrations were caused by a sonic boom, then what caused the sonic boom? Right? And this question of what caused the sonic boom is ultimately a mystery for, science so-called. But in Genesis, it tells us that God spoke everything into existence. So in that sense, string theory checks out. Right? By the word of the Lord, by the breath of his mouth, he spake and commanded, and it was there. Also, there's this interesting kind of parallel about how, when God speaks, right, the Creator speaks, this vibration will know it, will know his voice. But it goes further than just this idea of vibrational, vibration with string theory. It goes actually onto light. And we can say, God created light, let there be light. And so what we see when we analyze light is that it's, connected also to a frequency, right? You get the idea of the wavelength distance from one crest to another. I'm going to go into the whole thing here. But ultimately, out of the spectrum, our eye only picks up a small range of visible light. And this is what forms our colors. And so even color exists in an objective reality, which I think is bizarre to me. And let's now look upward, right? We kind of looked in, let's look up, let's look at the stars. And there's a lot of pieces here, but one very interesting one was, have you ever considered an eclipse? Like, what's the probability that an eclipse could even exist? Like, if you start to think through it, what are the implications that the sun is covered by the moon? Like, exactly, right? And so unless you believe in like a flat earth or something, the sun has to be exactly positioned, right, as a distant as it is the circumference is proportionally larger. So this is, by an obvious fact, an incredible coincidence that God had placed the sun, far enough away from the moon and the correct size in order for them to overlap. It's a huge fingerprint, right? It's just, there's just too many, as we start to looking at our existence here, it's just too many coincidences to see otherwise, right? The probability just stacks and stacks and stacks, and to the point where it's so improbable that we even exist, right? While you add it, let's like look at the moon, right? It's close enough to make an impact on the water and make tides, but not too close or too big where it pulls the water off the face of the earth. And so again, science tells us that, the moon is necessary for, Earth to be stable. It gives us the tides, etc. And so what we're at, this idea that we're ultimately in this incredibly small range that life could even exist, right? So it's this idea they call the Goldilocks, right? So the Goldilocks zone is this small thing where it's just far enough away from the sun where it doesn't burn, but not too far away from the sun that it freezes. And in any one of these on its own is like, okay, look, if you want to get into it, if you want to believe in, an infinite number of universes, which, okay, I'll get into that, then in an infinite number of universes, there would be, multiple Goldilockses, right? But then you have to layer in so many other pieces to that, right? It's not just the placement of one celestial body with another. It's further, right? In an example, Jupiter pulls all of these, space debris away from Earth. Okay. And so you'd say, okay, well, again, coincidental. Okay. But let's go deeper then. If we're going to look at Jupiter, have you ever considered the moons? Right? Why is there no consistency? Right? How is it that several of Jupiter's moons, right, or ultimately, and also Pluto's moon spins backwards, right? In fact, even the entire planet Venus spins backwards, and Uranus is on a completely different tilt. So, on surface level, you just say, well, no, it spins backwards. But if you were to believe the origin story, right, of a Big Bang, then according to the laws of conservation of angular momentum, then everything needs to spin the same way, right? Is this idea that, and we read here, the ultimate origin of the solar system, angular momentum remains obscure. And so these are people that are saying, yeah, we don't really get it, right? How do we ultimately explain this backwards, this reverse spin? And it's an issue that perplexes scientists, right? Planets would be spinning in the same direction as the source they came out of. So the article essentially says that, they were hit by an asteroid and started spinning another direction, which makes no sense. How big of an asteroid would it have to be to hit a planet and, like the size of Venus, and reverse its course without completely demolishing it? And also, if you hit it that hard, wouldn't it just like stop? And then how does it doesn't make sense. It is so many levels of that require an insane amount of belief, right? And ultimately, we have to understand that when scientists, they've shown this, when scientists can't figure stuff out, their ego gets in the way, and they invent things to make things work. And so, if you haven't heard of Planet Vulcan, look that one up. Planet Vulcan was essentially the solution to explain this gravitational pull, right? And they later came out that says, well, it actually doesn't exist. And so they built an entire theory around something that did not exist. There are far more simpler explanations that can be found than, far more simpler explanations. As we get in deeper and deeper into probability, what's the probability that God exists becomes more and more probable. And we could get into biology, right? So, I can't really see cellular respiration just spontaneously happening. Again, another layer. If we evolved from plants, right? No need to categorize a different biology, right? This whole idea, it's just too much. Then we get into geology. I mean, studying the sedimentation formation in the Grand Canyon, and geologists are doing backflips to try and explain this without accepting just a recent flood, right? The Bible makes it so clear, and yet we overcomplicate things. Speaking of the flood, what about fossils, right? This whole thing that, dinosaurs farted themselves in extinction, it's the same stuff they're telling us now, right? Cows are farting us in extinction, but they're not actually factoring in, well, what about, billionaires' jets and everything else? If you want to believe in climate change, maybe let's not look at, humans farting and cows farting. Why don't we look into something that's a little more industrial? But no, they don't want to look into that. Right? It reads here, 30 million years ago, monkeys rafted across the Atlantic to the South America, right? And this is kind of this idea that we're seeing these, and that's how they got there. But then Charles Darwin says, well, if my theory be true, numberless intermediate varies. So this is this idea of why aren't there transitional fossils, right? Because he would say, why do we not find, if we came from monkeys, and monkeys slowly evolved into men, then why don't we see fossils of monkeys, during the same period that had, been preserved, and also if there's a constant evolution, then why don't we see half monkey, half man now? And by the way, they actually did believe there was a specific race of people that they actually believed were half monkey, half men. And that gets in this idea of just the way of how biases and hubris inform much of our science. We could get into carbon dating, right? Why is there so much radiocarbon? This presentation by Doug Hove on carbon dating was fascinating. How scientists have been able to ignore how samples brought millions of thought to be millions of years old are still showing carbon 14, right? So how is that possible? And there's so many examples of this. Melvin Cook highlights a problem of carbon dating in this article, No Equilibrium Radiocarbon Dating Substantiated, where he essentially points out that there are something off between C14 formation and decay, and how carbon, radiocarbon is forming faster than it's decaying. So it's like we don't have time to look into this, and yet we just believe in evolution. We believe in these things without ever being able to actually look at them with a logical lens. Now, Kent Hovind, who's clearly a creationist, right? He uses a pretty interesting illustration of measuring a candle burning, right? It doesn't tell you when it started burning or how tall the candle was even when it started. All we can know is the rate of decay, or an example, the wax melting. That can be determined, but it's impossible to prove if the rate of decay was constant or even how much carbon was in it, right? How tall the candle was, right? It's impossible to improve. And yet we don't think about this. So no matter how useful it is, right, the radiocarbon method is still not capable of yielding accurate, reliable results. And this is coming from, Anthropological Journal of Canada. We read here, one part of this mammoth carbon dated at 29,000 years old and another part at 44,000. So how can you give two samples to two different labs and both of them give a very different interpretation? Right? Here we have another one, how the lower leg of this mammoth had a radiocarbon age of 15,000 years, while the skin and flesh 21. And there's just so many inconsistencies to use this and say, oh, carbon dating, right? There's a plus or minus through all of these, and that's to be expected. But what about the obvious ones, right? So these guys in the Antarctic Journal, they took a freshly killed seal and then sent it to a lab, and it was carbon dated at 1,300 years old. So that is not a margin of error of a little bit, right? Again here, shells from living snails were carbon dated as being 20,000 years old, even though they were living. Living mollusk shells were dated up to 2,300 years, right? We have another one here. Samples were not identified as a dinosaur in advance, and Russian scientists carbon dated the dinosaur bones at under 30,000 years. So they took these dinosaur bones and they're carbon dated under 30,000, right? And it's just kind of this idea of like, you can't use this, and material from layers which dinosaurs were found in carbon dated at 34,000 years. Okay, and if they're saying this is not a plus or minus issue, we're saying billions of years, we're saying millions of years. Well, that's very, very different than 34,000, which again is improbable, but that doesn't matter. It's this idea that we keep going through ancient human skeletons when dated by this this new accelerator mass spectrometer technique. It reads here, gave surprisingly recent dates. In one study, 11 sets of human bones were all dated about 5,000 radiocarbon years or less, which checks out. In 1933, scientists found wood, right, buried in basalt flows, and these samples were sent to laboratories to be, carbon 14 dated at 44,000 years old. But the basalt, right, was sent to two different laboratories, and it was dated at 45 million. So how can one be 45 and the other be 44,000? 45 million versus 44,000. Again, not a small margin of error. We also read how a German anthropology professor resigned from Frankfurt University panel because he made up and plagiarized data. It's all throughout. We see that the hubris of these scientists, they treat themselves as God, and rather than just making the obvious answer that there is a God or some sort of intelligent designer. Guardian again here, history of modern man unravels as German scholars expose as a fraud. And there's this vital missing link between modern humans and Neanderthals that was systematically falsified in the dates of this, numerous other Stone Age relics. And the outcome of this is they say anthropology now has to be revised its picture of modern man. So again, if a C14 date supports our theories, we put it in main text. If it does not entirely contradict them, we put it in a footnote. And if it's completely out of date, we just drop it. This is what they say. It's kind of like, if it doesn't match our theory, we just throw the data out. That's not science. Well, let's go to another piece. Why do all civilizations have a flood story? And you go through it. The flood myth is in every religion, right? Inca, Aztec, Norse, Hopi, like all of them have a flood myth. And so if all of these have local flood myths at the same time, then doesn't that make a you know a global flood? Each of these. It's interesting if we were to get into it. If you look into Matsuya, right? Saving from the Great Deluge. It's the same names as you'd find in the Bible, with Matsuya being Noah, Ham being Brahman. You have Vishnu. You have Shiva, right? You have Rama, which is Rama, Kush, which is Kush. Like it's all overlaid, and so even the Smithsonian Magazine says that sediment layers suggest a modern, flood, right? It goes in further. So ultimately, what it comes down to is this: what's so interesting is God has seen fit to make sure that there is no evidence that is so unmistakable that that he cannot be proven, but he cannot be disproven. This idea of this need for faith. And so ultimately, what do you put your faith in? Do you put your faith in science, or do you put your faith in which ultimately moves into a religion, or do you put your faith in a creator God, right? Which has far less requirements of probability. Anytime it feels though that the ways the scientists have been explaining things, it feels like it's always this idea of, well, it's quantum, right? Any abnormality, right, that we don't understand, they just say, well, it's explained by quantum. And, well, you just don't understand dark matter. And I just hate being in conversations where people reduct everything down to these two things, right? How do you explain the way the universe looks? Well, you don't understand dark matter. And by the way, dark matter is a hypothetical form, right? It feels like this new planet Vulcan that's been created in order to explain what they cannot explain, right? It's almost like this missing link. But we read here that, maybe dark matter doesn't exist at all, new research suggests. And it turns out that scientists are now saying that it's a modified theory of gravity that would explain the invisible, intangible dark matter. But, how hard they work to explain away God is bizarre. Again here, Albert Einstein's theory of general relativity, has confounded researchers for decades, and it has sprouted a handful of hypotheses attempting to explain the dissonance. So they can't figure stuff out, and so they invent things, it seems. That's how it seems to me, right? Again, was Einstein wrong? Some astrophysicists suggesting the theory of, questioning the theory of space-time. To better understand the universe, we may need to kill off one of the most important theories of all time. They are so baked into their cognitive biases, right? This idea of standing on the shoulders of what came before, that it doesn't feel like they're actually looking to disprove things. It looks like they're just looking to prove things with previous knowledge. That's not science, right? And so, dark energy is now essentially invented as a way to explain how the universe is accelerating. It's like everything is explained by quantum this, dark energy that, everything that it otherwise doesn't make sense. Look, what blows my mind is this idea that dark matter, dark energy are the answers, right? So all of the answers come from darkness rather than light. And we read in Ephesians that we wrestle against the world, against the rulers of darkness of this world. And by the way, if we get into the history of quantum mechanics, right? Look at, by the way, this guy here, right, Wolfgang Pauli, he was one of the pioneers of quantum physics. Look at the other people you can see in this list. Just by looking at it, you can kind of see their names, right in the center there, being Albert Einstein. So this guy, Wolfgang Pauli, he was distraught, drinking heavily after his divorce, and sought out psychoanalyst Carl Jung. And Jung was the one that actually termed, right, synchronicity to describe this principle of causal connections. And, he got this idea ultimately from Carl Jung. The interactions led him to argue for the necessity of a unified theory of matter and mind. So he was influenced by Carl Jung to argue the necessity of a unified theory of matter and mind. Science being influenced by theism. Do you see this? Right? Their interactions laid the foundation of Carl Jung's theory of collective unconscious. And we also see Schrodinger there, Einstein, right? Schrodinger, of course, being the idea of Schrodinger's cat, right? This idea of a state that's not decided, essentially, right? Because if it's not observable, it's not decided. I mean, it's a oversimplification, but you really get to this idea of poses the question of what exactly quantum superposition, where does it end, and really resolves into one possibility or the other, right? It's this, but I think when we get into it, we read here, in order for the known laws of physics to be mutually consistent, the universe must diverge to infinite computational power as it collapses into a final cosmological singularity, termed as the omega point, which has all the Hesites claimed for God in the traditional religions. So what they're saying is that in order for this all to make sense, there must be a singularity. There must be a God, but it's not the God. It can't be a creator God like we think. But there is a God. It just can't be the creator God. And it's this idea of like looking at the omega point. It's a supposed future when everything in the universe spirals towards a final point of unification. And this term was invented by a Jesuit priest, right? So again, there is so much religion baked into science that science doesn't feel like science, right? Now, again, I'm not talking about the fundamental laws, basic things that can be observed. I'm talking about the way we explain our existence is through religion. And so what religion ultimately do you want to choose, right? The religion of atheism, right? Where we are God, or the religion of monotheism, where we are created by God. Again, we kind of get into this idea of the singularity. And I'm not going to get into it. The point is this. We read here, I believe that the omega point theory deserves to become the prevailing theory in the future of space-time until it is experimentally or otherwise refuted. So what they're saying is that until we can refute this concept, right, which came from a Jesuit priest, until we can refute this concept, let's just accept it as fact. And that becomes the fabric of our reality. It's just crazy, right? This is the leading quantum physicist, right? And it's just, I don't know. I can't get into it. The point is this. Even physicists don't understand quantum mechanics. And worse, they don't seem to want to understand it. They're happy to just have something that's unexplainable to fill in the gaps. That way they can continue on getting their grant money, right? And so the question becomes, why has science stopped trying to identify or understand quantum theory? It is practical truism that no one really understands quantum mechanics. Yet, quantum theory reigns as the dominant theory of the very small, just as relativity does for the very large. And so we have just given up. Quantum is the god of scientism. And it's really baffling to how many scientists defy the probability of God because it can't be proved, and yet invent incredibly overcomplicated theories to prove God away that they have not even been able to prove, right? Or even tried to prove. They just accept as belief. And so, to me, after researching Wolfman's work on, brachial space, right, it only further reinforces the idea of creative design, right? The multi-way graph could be considered a visualization of free will. And it's so beautiful as you start to look at this and say, this is the mechanisms that God put in place. That way we can have free will and not bump into each other, right? And so, the gaps formed using Wolfram's Rule 30 could be seen as an illustration of how free will, when imposing on others free will, deviates from God's perfect will. And these patterns or abnormalities show the disease of self-interest. But let's just come back to it. The idea simply is this. There is a difference between beliefs and facts. Ultimately, it feels like people are believing in scientism instead of hard evidence, right? Most science is either observational, or direct extrapolation of the observations. But there's this other portion we talked about earlier, this portion of scientific theory, which is not very scientific. The first layer of science defines or explains our observations. The second layer of science fills in the gaps which cannot be seen or experienced with, extrapolations based on what we can. And the layer ultimately, this layer is based on logical conclusions of things that, we can kind of prove, right? But the first two layers do not require belief, only trust. And I should not need to believe in science. However, increasingly there seems to be a cult forming, taking the name of science, but telling us that we should not need to believe our own eyes. And so it's like we're pulling away from the basic stuff that is just obvious to us if we just look, and we can't even believe that because, well, I don't have a a PhD in science. I can't explain that to you. Well, it shouldn't require that. Why did we give away the basics? Forrest Mims is a scientific writer for over 20 years. He's published in National Geographic, Science Digest, the American Journal of Science, yada, 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 like 60 over magazines. And he was denied a job as a writer because he was a creationist, right? And it's just so interesting how they've already decided what the viewpoint would be. And they are not allowing science to be science, right? It has to fit their narrative or it's not allowed. Baylor University in Waco, Texas, fired a teacher because he advocated intelligent design. There's a newspaper article for that. Kevin Haley, biology teacher at Central Oregon Community College, lost his job for exposing errors in the textbooks. World Magazine, right there. Roger DeHart, science teacher at Burlington High in Seattle, Washington, was told he could not inform students of errors in the textbooks by passing outlines from current science journals. So he wasn't even allowed to share articles in science journals that contradicted the textbooks, because if those textbooks fall, the entire thing crumbles. We read, evolution is promoted by its practitioners as far more than science. Evolution is promulgated as an ideology, as a secular religion, a full-fledged alternative to Christianity with meaning and morality. Evolution, it was, by the way, this is coming from a Darwinian atheist, Michael Ruse. He says flat out, evolution is a religion. This was true of evolution in the beginning, and it's true of evolution still today. And so, the question is, do any of these apply, right, to those indoctrinated by the theory of evolution? And don't get me wrong, there's these, there also apply the belief that, there's a particular form of religion. And this is my point. If someone becomes defensive about any scientific theory, it's because it's their religion. If they can't look at things objectively and say, oh, let's just study the data. Well, let's look at this data. No, if you bring anything up about religion, right, immediately, right, it contradicts their religion. Dr. Henry Morris writes, evolutionists believe in evolution because they want to, and evolutionism is thus intrinsically an atheist religion. Richard Feynman, right? Theoretical physics. He says, science is the belief in the ignorance of experts, right? Like, this is not fringe people. This is like at the core. They accept that it's a religion. And I recommend this video, Nobel Prize recipient Carrie Mullis, who poses this question: if we've made science our final arbiter of what's right and wrong. We read here that claiming that we have solved the problem of the origin of the universe, or that string theory is correct and the final theory of everything is at hand, such statements are bogus. 1930, Albert Einstein published in the New York Times magazine about 3 human impulses which develop religious belief. He says, fear, social and moral concerns, and cosmic religious feeling. And he maintained that even though the realms of religion and science in themselves are clearly marked off from each other, there is a strong reciprocal relationship and dependencies. And aspiring to truth, right, to derive from this religious sphere, right, continuing, right? So it just goes on, and while Einstein was skeptical of the existence of a, anthropomorphic God, he continued that the doctrine of a personal God interfering with natural events could never be refuted. And so even they accept that you cannot disprove God in the same way that I cannot prove God to you, right? Now, probability-wise and also personal experience-wise, I've already proven God to myself. I just can't hand that belief to you because beliefs cannot be transferred. And that's the whole point. It must be a personal relationship. And so I believe that everyone is entitled to their own ideas, but they should not feel entitled to push their ideas on everyone, right? I need to start a collection of these sayings somewhere. The point is this. Malcolm Muggeridge writes, I myself am convinced that the theory of evolution, especially to the extent which it has been applied, will be one of the greatest jokes in the history books of the future. The bottom line is, if you believe in the theory of evolution, which is only a theory, then none of what I have said so far will change your mind. And I don't want to change your mind. My only agenda is for you to truly think for yourself. If you come out of this and you do the research for yourself and you say, you know what, I believe the Big Bang Theory. Okay. I believe, in aliens. Okay. Right. I have friends that I have conversations with. What you'll find with me is that I'm the first one that will take off my hat, so to speak, and I'm happy to have conversations with atheists and with people that believe that we're in a machine. I'll have detailed conversations with them because I believe that it's important to understand, what other people think. But at the same regard, if people are not willing to have dialogue and they have not based any of their information on anything other than just, what they believe, it's just sad to me. And it's hard for me to respect that, to be honest. And so ultimately, when asking the supposed intellectual community of their beliefs, I shouldn't be getting what I usually get is, I don't believe in God, I believe in science. And something about the words believe in science just feels off to me. Belief is an acceptance of something without proof. Isn't the idea of, of science actually the opposite, right? Of the scientific method, right? There is no place for religion in science. That's all I'm saying. And so to be clear, scientific fact is just that. But theories should not be treated as fact. And if this statement makes you uncomfortable, or if you're feeling defensive right now and triggers, this kind of retorts that you should not actually understand things like carbon dating and all this, I just humbly ask you to reread the section on groupthink, where I listed the signs. And these are the signs of groupthink. And most people who attack these little straw mans or are trying to, that are going to argue with this in the comments, are bought into a cult. And that's okay if you want to believe that. I'm just saying, don't believe it, arbitrarily. Have actually done the work yourself, right? Study to show yourself approved. Let's simplify this. There's the observable and the unobservable. The unobservable requires faith, and the observable requires facts. Religious beliefs are formed through unobservable faith. Scientific proof is formed through observable facts. And then there's this middle ground that's an extrapolation of the observable, right? Based on what is observable, we can collect evidence that, while not conclusive enough to be a fact, is consistent with all the available knowledge and supports a scientific theory on something. Right? Further out, across the threshold of science in the land of belief, lies hypothesis. These are only ideas which do not have enough evidence to be grounded in reality. They're just ideas. And maybe they're the ideas by very smart scientists, but they're just ideas. And I believe everyone is entitled to their own ideas, but they should not feel entitled to push their ideas on others. We can jump from facts into forming theories. We can jump to conclusions and form ideas. But ultimately, to understand what we're doing here, it cannot be a concretely determined and requires this huge leap of faith, right? It's a jump, it's a leap, And so what's this idea essentially is that we've just got to start thinking for ourselves. We can go from facts to forming theories and form ideas, but ultimately to understand what we're doing here, it cannot be completely or concretely determined by and require a leap of faith, right? So let's simplify this again. We see this idea right again, right? The difference, observable and unobservable. And so if you haven't already, I highly recommend the course on rethinking thinking. But a piece of this here is just this: despite the overwhelming evidence in favor of intelligent design, and this is from Dr. Nicholas Cartes, I will concede that I'm unable to scientifically prove that God does exist, but I'm also unable to scientifically prove that God does not exist. If we analyze the elements of the evolutionary theory, we will fit it non-empirical. We will find essentially a non-empirical, completely unattestable any scientific laboratory setting. It's also quite unfathomable how a speck of dust exploded, resulting in the universe, and then how life began from nothing. Why is this even considered science? We materialists cannot allow a divine foot in the door. John Lennox writes here that materialism rejects both the divine foot and, come to think of it, the door as well. And this is the whole point, is that they cannot allow this in, because if they allow it in, right, in any other form than metaphysics, right, it just the whole thing crumbles. Much of evolutionary theory is pure speculation, right? It's not testable in a laboratory. It's non-empirical, and so, this whole again of like how dust exploded, resulting in universe in the first cell, right, gave rise how right to living organisms. That's still missing. It's so utterly complex beyond anything that has ever been created. So ultimately, a being who can consider whence he came. This is not testable. Why is it even science? Again, this idea of the 19th century political economy, it began to expand in all natural economy. Okay, and that's where it's coming from. We read here that modern evolutionary bigotry tells us there are no gods, no purpose, no life after death, no meaning to life, no free will for humans. And this is what is being pushed. But the crazy part, right, is that, while this idea, if you were to poll people, while the idea of the nuns is, there's no God, right? While that's increasing, those who believe there's a higher power far outweigh those who don't. So why is it that evolution is taught in school as a fact when 80% of the population of the world believes in some sort of higher power, some sort of creative power? It blows my mind how the cult of reasoning, how atheism has been able to infiltrate, right? And so it's so inverted based on the actual population. If intelligent design is at 80% and only 8% of them are saying, no, it's not, then why is 67% of it being taught that evolution is a science? Right? It's so backwards. If just looking at this has got to make sense to you, right? It's got to make sense that, like, how is it that we're even going against? This is what creates cognitive dissonance. This is what creates those feelings of anxiety for thinkers, right? The First Amendment is about separation of church and state. So why are we teaching scientific theory as a fact in schools? It's the same school that they pledge allegiance to a nation under God, and then they get taught that we evolved from monkeys. So where do you think this anxiety comes from, right? It's this idea that you can't go from one class to another, and in one class we're saying, oh, God exists, and the next class we're saying, no, God doesn't exist, we came from monkeys. It doesn't overlap. Adolf Hitler was one that wrote, let me control the textbooks, and I'll control the state. There's a correlation there, guys. And Timothy says, we are to avoid profane and vain babblings, and oppose science, so falsely so-called science. And so ultimately the conclusion is this. Occam's razor is that the simplest explanation usually is the best one. And so the question is, right, using scientific theory of Occam's razor, what's more likely? What's the simplest explanation, right? That we, that a cyclic universe has multiple, like this idea we put in perspective, right? Just using this, probabilistic approach, the narrative of a cyclic multiverse with multiple brains of unknown knowledge, unknown origin, that have collided, causing a big bangs, when then the universe bounces back and passes through time, and they're all pulled back together, and then again collide, destroying the old contents and creating them anew. Like what? Like you got to be kidding me here, right? The probability of that is 1 in like infinity. And again, it doesn't explain where did math comes. How unlikely is it we're in a perfect Goldilocks zone? Why, tides. Like, it doesn't prove, again, going back to the very, very, very beginning, the consciousness. How do we solve consciousness? It's so ridiculously improbable. Or we could take Occam's razor and just analyze the probability that God exists. It's like 1 in 2. Lee Strobel says, to continue in atheism, I would need to believe that nothing produces everything, non-life produces life, randomness produces fine-tuning, chaos produces information, unconsciousness produces consciousness, and non-reason produces reason. I just don't have that much faith, right? When it comes down to it, evolution just doesn't make sense against intelligent design. And Ellen White talks about that, through the creator, we're to become acquainted with, through creation, we're to become acquainted with the creator. And the book of nature is a lesson book. This comes down in true education, the idea that we can actually learn everything about our purpose just from gardening, right? Just from being in nature, we will learn everything about our creator. But what happens? We're told that gardening is below us, right? We're told, we're built, parking lots of cement, right? Concrete jungles that we're put into. We're put into sterile classrooms. We are so far removed from anything that our creator could speak to us. And that's how the deceiver is able to convince us of stuff that does not make any sense if we were to wake up. Go spend time in nature and tell me that, that God does not exist. We read, in these direct lessons from nature, there's simplicity and purity. The beauty of nature lends the soul away from the sin and worldly affections. Right? To open the mind of students who are occupied with men's theories and speculations and falsely called science and philosophy. Ecclesiastes says, I applied my heart to know and to search and to seek out wisdom and the reason of things and to know the wickedness of folly and even foolishness and madness. But sanctify the Lord in your hearts and be ready always to give an answer. We need to be able to explain our existence. It's the most basic thing that we should be able to understand. Right? And so I recommend, learning more about just basic stuff. So again, I don't want to attack anyone's beliefs. And I know it may sound like through this. It's just, to me, it's so improbable. And most of the people I communicate with accept that, it requires belief, that they can't prove it, right? Or if they're not there yet, they're using things that are so improbable, or they're not, or they'll just say, I don't understand it. I don't have a science degree, right? And again, I'm not questioning the fundamentals of science, but I am absolutely questioning the religion of science. And so it's up to us to figure out, what makes sense. And I recommend, continuing this course in the course on theism. There's so much to be gained by understanding our purpose. And so I really recommend that we take some time to just to think and reflect